Welcome to the Altruistic Libertarian, advocate for a genuinely free society. I am Anthony Wheeler, and today we begin a sequence on wars and the rumor of war. We begin the sequence on war with words from the West's first historian, Herodotus, and I quote, "No one is foolish enough to choose war instead of peace. In peace, sons bury fathers, but in war, fathers bury sons," unquote. I should be able to stop there. The case made, no more words necessary. But for inexplicable reasons, we generally accept political violence as normal and hold political states to moral standards that would appall a civilized mind if those same standards were applied to personal relationships. Musil states the case as follows, and I quote, "The naive moral demands that one not break contracts, not lie, not covet one's neighbor's goods, and not kill do not yet prevail in relations among states. Their place is taken by the single principle of pursuing one's own advantage, which is realized through force, cunning, and businessmen's tactics in applying pressure. As a result, every state is naturally recognized as criminal by the inhabitants of other states, but thanks to relationships that would merit sociological analysis, it appears to its own inhabitants as the embodiment of the honor and moral maturity," unquote. The altruistic libertarian would apply the same principle regarding violence and the threat of violence to nation states. This means using violence only in direct defense of the nation's citizens and only against those who initiate its threat. Failure to do so promises a future as bloody and destructive as the recent past. The United States, for all of its political rhetoric and vocal championship of democratic values, has repeatedly behaved in an unprincipled manner, visiting violence, pain, and destruction on millions of the world's citizens, often without sufficient purpose or justification. While the United States can hardly be compared to the brutal regimes of Hitler, Stalin, or Mao, as citizens, we can demand an accounting of our nation's political action, one that meets our moral standards, given that it is our wealth, through taxes, and our young men and women who fight and kill and die on behalf of the state. We should only support such expenditure or the deployment of our honorable armed forces into harm's way for the right reasons. As a nation, we should never engage in unprincipled conflicts that result in death of anybody and the destruction of someone else's home. The First Gulf War. As a recent example of how such principles might be applied, consider the First Gulf War. While it may be possible to criticize the United States and their conduct in the war, on the surface it appears that the actions taken by the U.S. were basically justified for the following reasons. Number one, Iraq violated international law with their violent invasion of Kuwait. Maintaining international rule of law is a worthy justification. 2. The U.S. acted in concert with the world community, including Arab and Islamic states, in opposing Iraq. 3. The air war was conducted far more discriminately, reducing civilian casualties. The advent of smart weapons allowed precise targeting, eliminating the need for the carpet bombing so prevalent in previous conflicts. 4. Once Iraq was militarily defeated, the U.S. halted the invasion. No efforts were made to replace the leadership or commence a nation building. In contrast to the First Gulf War, several international conflicts can be criticized for violating the basic political principles advocated by the altruistic libertarian, beginning at the turn of the 20th century. The Spanish-American War. In 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. War had been brewing for some time between the U.S. and Spain, mostly due to an insurrection in Cuba. When the sinking of the Maine was blamed on the Spaniards, which turns out was highly unlikely, most likely an accident caused the destruction, the U.S. declared war against Spain and within a matter of weeks defeated that small European country. The war against Spain didn't last very long, nor were there many casualties on either side. But the implications of that conflict changed the larger course of history, beginning in the Philippines. After the U.S. Navy defeated the Spanish in Manila, they proceeded to take military control of the islands with the enthusiastic help from Filipino guerrillas, men and women who had been fighting against Spanish rule. Contrary to democratic principles, the Americans decided to take the place of the Spanish as foreign rulers. The Filipinos understandably took exception, and a new war erupted, one that would last for several years and cost the Filipinos over 34,000 killed in direct combat, with several hundred thousand civilian casualties, mostly due to hunger and disease. This is what Mark Twain wrote at the time, and I quote, "There is the case of the Philippines. I have tried hard, and yet I cannot for the life of me comprehend how we got into that mess. Perhaps we could not have avoided it. Perhaps it was inevitable that we should come to be fighting the natives of those islands, but I cannot understand it, and have never been able to get at the bottom of the origin of our antagonism to the natives. I thought we should act as a protector, not try to get them under our heel. We were to relieve them from Spanish tyranny to enable them to set up a government of their own, and we were to stand by and see that it got a fair trial. It was not to be a government according to our ideas, but a government that represented the feeling of the majority of Filipinos, a government according to Filipino ideas. That would have been a worthy mission for the United States. But now, why, we've got into a mess, a quagmire from which each fresh step renders the difficulty of extrication immensely greater. I'm sure I wish I could see what we were getting out of it, and all it means to us as a nation." Unquote. It was a terrible mess, and led to horrible actions on the part of American soldiers. The following statements were made in letters to home from a New York-born soldier, and I quote, "The town of Tatasia was surrendered to us a few days ago, and 2 companies occupied the same. Last night one of our boys was found shot and his stomach cut open. Immediately orders were received from General Wheaton to burn the town and kill every native in sight, which was done to finish. About 1,000 men, women, and children were reported killed. I am probably growing hard-hearted, for I am in my glory when I can sight my gun on some dark skin and pull the trigger." Unquote. And this from a Corporal Sam Gillis. Quote, "We make everyone get into his house by 7 p.m., and we only tell a man once. If he refuses, we shoot him. We killed over 300 natives the first night. They tried to set the town on fire. If they fire a shot from a house, we burn that house down and every house near it and shoot the natives, so they're pretty quiet in town now." Unquote. While peace in the Philippines was made official in 1902, some 3 years after the war began, hostilities continued until 1913. In the end, the U.S. had their first Asian colonial possession, the first expansion of a new imperialist power, a political practice that continues to this day. American occupation of the Philippines would have historic consequences when it sparked Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor a few decades later. World War I. Unlike World War II, it is very difficult to understand why the U.S. became involved in a European conflict in 1917. Historians list the following 5 reasons. 1. German atrocities in Belgium. One factor that had a major influence on American public opinion was the invasion of neutral Belgium and stories of German atrocities in the country which shocked and outraged the Americans. Stories of unarmed civilians being killed and small towns being destroyed circulated throughout the press. Although some of the stories were British propaganda, they left a strong anti-German sentiment among Americans. My comment. Atrocities frequently happen in foreign war zones, and unless they reach the proportions of Rwanda, Cambodia, or Bosnia, the U.S. has no justification getting involved. If the U.S. Marines were deployed with every report of atrocities, there wouldn't be any left. Marines, that is. 2. Economic interests. The American businessmen were very interested in the Allied victory, and many, such as J.P. Morgan, helped to fund British and French war efforts with approximately $3 billion in loans and bond purchases. If the Allies would be defeated by the Central Powers, they probably wouldn't be able to repay their debt to the U.S. lenders. Many businessmen therefore supported the so-called preparedness movement, which campaigned for the U.S. intervention in the war on the side of the Allied forces. My comment. Commercial interests are never justification for war, ever. Period. Full stop. 3. Sinking of the Lusitania. In May 1915, 2 years before we got in the war, a German U-boat sunk the British passenger ship Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. Over 1,000 passengers were killed, including 128 Americans. Although the ship may have been carrying military equipment along with the civilians, the Americans were infuriated because the people on board weren't warned before the sinking. In addition to straining diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Germany, the sinking of the Lusitania further increased anti-German sentiment in America. My comment. The Lusitania was in a war zone and a legitimate military target. All on board should have known the risk. Now, if the ship was sailing off New Jersey coast and not Ireland, different story. That might be considered an aggressive act of war against the U.S. But it wasn't, that is, sailing off the coast of the U.S., so it wasn't, that is, justification for war. 4. Unrestricted submarine warfare. In response to Britain's blockade, Germany turned to unrestricted submarine warfare to keep goods from reaching Britain. After the sinking of Lusitania, Germany promised to stop unrestricted submarine warfare, but within less than 1 year, they torpedoed another passenger ship, the cross-English Channel ferry Sussex. Again, the Germans promised not to attack passenger ships without warning, the Sussex Pledge, but that pledge was short-lived as well. My comment. Again, this was a terrible war between England and Germany taking place on the other side of the Atlantic. Not our business, not our fight. 5. The Zimmermann Telegram. In 1917, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent a telegram to Mexico suggesting that if the U.S. should declare war on Germany, Mexico should declare war on the U.S. In return, Mexico would get back the territory lost in the Mexican-American War, that is Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Unfortunately for Germany, the telegram was intercepted by the British and hurriedly given to the Americans. Although Mexico had no real intention of declaring war on the U.S., publication of the letter further mobilized the American people against the Central Powers. My comment. So what? Even if Mexico declared a war against the U.S., very unlikely in any case, the U.S. would fight Mexico, not Germany. I am sure such messages get sent all the time during war. Just another desperate measure in time of war. In summary, none of these reasons seem compelling. The U.S. was in no danger from Germany or Austria. Atrocities frequently occur around the world that go unpunished. Americans sailing in war zones put their own lives in danger, and business interests can never justify bloodshed. The war cost Americans 116,000 dead and 204,000 wounded. It's impossible to predict how things might have changed had America not been involved, but it couldn't have been much worse. The Treaty of Versailles is widely seen as the impetus for Germany's resurgence and foundation for World War II. Perhaps a different ending to World War I would have prevented the rise of National Socialism some 15 years later. Who knows? World War II. Of all American conflicts, this one seems clearly justified. The safety and security of American citizens was clearly at stake, as were their sovereign boundaries. Not everyone understood this at the time of Pearl Harbor, but in hindsight, America had no choice but to defend itself against two dominating threats: Hitler's National Socialism and Stalin's Communist State. Both the fascists and communists would destroy America as we know it. The future of liberal democracy was at stake. Germany's defeat left Europe in shambles, and Stalin ruling over a massive territory in Europe and Asia, with future wars to be fought, Korea, Vietnam, as an aftermath to the Soviet victory. Untold millions suffered and died under Stalin, and large populations held in totalitarian terror for almost 50 years after the war. In the East, Japan's invasion of China arguably provided the opportunity for Mao in China, as World War I had done for Lenin in Russia 20 years earlier, to wage and win a civil war that put the communists in power, wreaking terrible harm on the Chinese people. For example, it is estimated by some historians that China's Great Leap Forward in the 1950s cost more Chinese lives than all the lives lost on all sides in World War II. World War II was bad business for everyone involved. So much senseless death and destruction. But ultimately, a price that the U.S. had to pay. Well, that concludes our show for today. Next time we continue our examination of war. Until then, peace.